Welcome to Now Serving, a Side of Therapy, your intro guide into the therapeutic world. Together, we'll explore various aspects around how to show up for ourselves and others by tending to our own mental and emotional well-being. I'm your host, Dalton Huckaby, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm grateful you've joined me.
Suzy to give a little introduction about herself.
Okay, thank you, Dalton. I'm really excited to be here and hopefully address some of the questions with you that folks may have, particularly if they're newer to therapy. I'm Suzy Dito. I became a licensed marriage and family therapist about a year and a half ago already, but I graduated from the California Institute of Integral Studies way back in the early 2000s, and then I waited a bit of time before getting my hours. In the meantime, I'm a registered yoga therapist as well as a meditation teacher, so I frequently intermingle a lot of my integral health background and yoga and meditation skills with my psychology with folks.
Actually gives me some insight into some other ideas, like how to incorporate meditation into yoga, into therapy. I mean, we might have to have you back for a guest speaker on one of those topics.
Yes, and it's completely individual. I'm more of a dynamic meditator, which means I like to move to stay within my body somatically. Some people can sit and just sort of zone out. That's not my style. And I think the one thing I like to tell people is your meditation style changes drastically, as you continue it. It evolves just as you evolve. So,
this is interesting, and I don't want to get off topic of what we have planned for today, but I have been thinking how it would be interesting to how to move the body, right, in like a therapy session, how there's something to that. Right. Kind of like the somatic feel to kind of when we're engaging in the therapeutic process. I've been thinking about that. So I'd be curious to pick your brain in the future about that some more.
Oh, absolutely. I love the riff too when I talk with other folks of, whether it be a client, what works for you, what doesn't. People think, oh, I have to do it right. But I learn as much from my clients frequently as I offer.
Last session, we ended at we were talking about how to establish like a good fit, right? And what potential clients can expect in that initial intake and consult, right? And then in this episode, we're kind of thinking of the ideas around like, so we're in therapy, now what, right? Well, I think that there are also some things that people that it's important to consider around like what is the role of the therapist and what it is not, right? Just to have some clarity around that. And in order to help us identify that, I thought maybe we could get into a little bit of discussion around how can we identify what are some of the red flags to look out for when we're in the room to determine if this is a good fit or if I should be looking for someone else.
Right. And, I just want to add, because I say this even as a yoga instructor when I teach groups, just because it's not a fit doesn't mean the therapist is doing anything bad or wrong. I think it's just that acceptance. And on the flip side of that, it doesn't mean the therapist is always right either. The therapist should be bringing you right to your own awarenesses. I think that's how both of us work. But good rapport and trust, at least to me, and I'll speak from a personal, not a professional, but a personal space of with my experience with my therapist, if I didn't have a great rapport or for some reason I wasn't trusting them, I couldn't do the work with them. I couldn't go deep enough to really feel the shift. And I don't think people should ignore that. Rapport and trust is vital.
It's huge, right? Yeah. We touched on that a little bit last time too, and And I think that, some of these red flags that we'll be talking about, right, they may be a little bit obvious, but they are important to help us to be able to say, oh, yeah, these red flags are pretty obvious reasons why, that trust and, in that, or that good fit may not happen, right, when we look at some of these. And one example of that, for example, is like boundary violations.
Right, right. And once again, I think a lot of people, particularly when this is your first therapy experience, you may not be aware that there is a boundary violation. So to sort of sit back and, just as I did with my own children, notice your uh-oh alarms. It's like, oh, why are they asking me about, the details of X, Y, or Z? Or, why do they want to talk to someone in my life? It's like, no, your therapy time is confidential between you and your therapist. And, if you're not feeling quite right, I'd like to think you'd be able to say, hey, I'm not quite comfortable with this. But of course, if you aren't, because it's a newer relationship, right? Just avoid the question. Tell them that you're not comfortable answering that right now. I mean,
I've heard of aha experiences, but I've never heard of uh-oh moments. I love that, right? I love that. And it's important too, because sometimes, right, like you said, we're kind of, when we first enter into therapy, we may not know what to expect or exactly how things work. Hopefully there's some communication, right, between the therapist and the client to get some clarity and set some structure and precedence around what that really looked like. But even then, some people may not know how to communicate with, oh, I feel like you crossed my boundary, right? Or, express their concerns, but they'll tell you through the behavior, whether it's an adult or a child or minor, right? They'll let you know through the behavior.
Right. Also, I mean, it's such an intimate relationship, right? I mean, and I just have to say that it's not expected that you're just going to pour your heart out in the first few sessions. It could take 6 months, a year, more, 2 years to really be able to share. I've heard from some of my clients that I've had for 3 years, I never felt comfortable telling you this, but now I do. Now I'm ready to talk about something. That is normal. I just want to put that out there. You do not have to dig deep too quickly. This is supposed to be, a process that works at your pace, not the therapist's pace.
Exactly. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, that's huge, and kind of gives us, as the client, right? When I say the client too, I can mean like any of us, right? Like,
absolutely,
we're therapists, but we're also clients too, right? So, but allow ourselves to have that permission, like, okay, I can go at this at my own pace.
Right. Yeah.
But what would you say? So, for example, when we're talking about like identifying potential red flags that might contribute to that sense of we're not feeling a spark with the therapist, right? Like, what's an example of like some boundary violations, would you say?
Well, I think if your therapist is reaching out to you between your sessions, emailing you frequently, just checking in, therapists are not your friends. You need to trust them. You need to like them on some level, but they are not meant to be your friends. They're not someone that you go have coffee with. It's actually a very good sign if that's something you kind of want to do with your therapist, because that means that you feel that they're getting you and that you have that rapport.
And that attachment too.
Because that's when some deep work can actually happen and they can reflect that back to you. But, they're not a person that you're going to call when something great or not so great happens in the moment. They're, constant emails. It's one thing for you to email them between a session and saying, hey, I want to make sure I talk about X, Y, or Z because it's really forefront today and I'm not going to see you for a few days. but it's, the session time is sort of privileged special time that things should be saved for. So that could be one breach
Yeah, you're
for
talking
me.
about like dual relationships, right? We're trying to
Dual
prevent
relate.
dual relationships.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. And,
yeah.
a lot of people, I think you ought to think twice. I mean, you may really like your therapist, and a friend of yours or even an acquaintance needs a therapist. You may want to rethink, do you want the therapist should also be thinking about is this correct for my client, for me to see and have that conversation? Therapy is this wonderful container where you can practice having some very difficult conversations, and the therapist should be able to do that with you. I always tell my clients too, I can't take you any further than where I've gone personally in my own therapy. So, those are some hard conversations too, when I admit that, hey, you know what? Am I serving you? Am I able to do you feel my understanding here? And I've made, even if it's a brief referral to another therapist that can support that client in a different way.
Yeah, you're bringing up a good point too, right? As far as like, do I feel that the therapist training and experience is a good match for
Yes.
my needs, and does that contribute to that good fit?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And I appreciate you mentioning that, because it's not all about, oh, I like you, I want to work with you kind of thing, or XYZ people think you're great. Is my experience appropriate for your needs at this time? So, and having some questions prepared when you do interview. I suspect you've already talked about that, but what are some important questions that you may want to know? Now, if you've never done therapy, that's hard to come up with, but if you do know people who have, therapy experience, ask them, what's a question you think would have been helpful to you to ask your therapist before you began therapy? So,
Yep, that's a great idea, because that actually encourages the client's participation in contributing to that client therapist relationship.
right. Right.
Mhm.
Something I also wanted to touch upon, I think where I want to play both, both sides of the same coin, devil's advocate. Therapy is not about going to therapy and feeling great after every session. Effective and good therapy should make you uncomfortable at times. So also keeping that in mind and continuing that conversation when you return to the therapist the next week, saying, hey, I walked out of here really upset. Hey, can we talk about that? Or how can we address this? Because it stuck with me for X number of hours or maybe even days. Because that could be a really good edge for the therapist to help you unwind and process. Or it could be an indication that the therapist is jostling you up, but not able to take you through to process it completely so you can then, move forward.
Yeah, you're talking about risks and benefits of
Right.
therapy, right?
Right.
Like we
Right.
talk about when you're kind of first establishing that connection with the therapist, right? Perhaps there's some discussion around, sometimes at first it might feel awkward or more challenging before things get better.
Right. Right. And of course, there are a few clients that come in and say, I want to get this over with as quickly as possible. I want to move through this, because they're really in need of feeling differently. And hopefully the therapist is talking about this is a journey. It's not a goal. There's not an end point necessarily, because your life is, an ebb and flow. So slowing down and becoming more aware in the moment too. Hopefully your therapist is helping you do that. And quite frankly, are they meeting your needs? I mean, are they addressing what you're bringing into session, or are they bringing in things that you're like, because that's happened to me. They've brought in things that I've like, is that what I just said? So it was good that they brought that to my attention, but actually they were off track, and hopefully they're checking in with you. Is this meeting your needs? And if it isn't, that's a different
Yeah,
conversation.
that could be a red flag, right? When we're talking about these
Exactly.
red flags, like, is the therapist kind of like clarifying, right? And, showing me that they understand what what I'm saying, right, and trying to understand me at my level.
Right. Well,
Mhm.
no one should feel judged or dismissed in a session. I'm of course things happen, and where therapists are human beings too, but in general you should feel heard and validated as much as possible. So, and that leads me to, how much disclosure is your therapist offering you? Are they talking entirely about their lives? Or, are they using it as an example, maybe briefly, but then talking to you? I also tell people the 70-30 split. My hope is that you're going to be speaking as the client 70% of the time. I'm going to be speaking about 25 to 30% of the time. And once again, it's not 90% client and 10% therapist. It goes in both directions, right? So, but it's not it's not a conversation like you're having with a friend either.
Speaking of having those conversations, right? When we think about the initial sessions, there's typically some discussion around confidentiality, right? And maintaining that confidentiality,
Right.
right? And do I trust that what I'm telling this person, the therapist, right? Do, as part of that trust that we were talking about earlier, do I feel like they'll be able to contain that?
Yes.
Right. And so if there ought to be some clarification up front, right? Again, as therapists, right, we're mandated reporters. So, the only time that there is a confidentiality breach is if we feel like there's harm to self or to others, right?
Right.
Or if there's any suspected child or elder abuse.
Right. Right. And your therapist is hopefully slowing you down if they think you're entering an area that might be a disclosure or mandated reporter situation. They should give you that feedback. Hey, are we heading into an area? Remember what I told you way back, when we first began. I also like to talk about informed consent, Dalton, because you are not obligated to have one more session with a therapist. If things are not working out for you in the moment, you could say, thank you so much, Suzy. I'm not going to be returning to therapy, whether that's through an email or a text even. And no therapist, talk about a red flag, should be hunting you down and saying, no, we need a closing session. I don't want to see you go, or, hey, give me a couple more weeks. So just to keep that in mind, you are in control and should feel empowered.
Absolutely. We did touch on that a little bit last episode, right? Wherein, if we're the ones that are initiating services, right, then we're the ones who can, pause them at any time.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So we've identified, right, a few red flags, right, that we can look out for within that client therapist relationship to help us determine, right, should I keep going with this, right? Again, that we're talking about at those earlier on sessions, right, when we're still establishing that rapport and that connection in the client therapist relationship. Are there any other red flags that you can think of at the moment before we move on?
I think paying attention to how you feel after your therapy sessions on average. And, it takes time to build rapport. It's not done in one or two sessions. I mean, as we know in therapists, the first session is just a lot of questions just to sort of get this holistic view of your life and your mental, physical, emotional health. So this takes time. And knowing yourself, am I a person that connects with people right away and then I kind of cling to them? Or am I a person that needs a long time to warm up to someone? Keeping your own processes in mind as you develop this rapport in your relationship with your therapist too. Hey, I'm not a person that warms up quickly. So, do I feel that spark? Well, she's interesting. She's bringing up some good points. I may stick with it. This is your time and money. So, but it's also not an instant gratification thing. I think of therapy as really more of a delayed gratification too.
And that's the thing, right? There's a fine line, right, between identifying, okay, these are true red flags, and I don't feel that spark, right? And I
Right.
don't want to continue versus, oh, I'm being challenged, and maybe this is a good way to learn how to work through those challenges.
Exactly. Well, and I don't mean to assume this is obvious, but of course, no therapist should be touching you, hugging you, requesting a hug from you, you
That's
know.
what I was going to ask earlier too, right? When we talk about boundary violations, it's when we talk about boundaries, right? It's more than just physical boundaries, right? We can also think about time, right?
Yes.
Boundaries around time. Are we showing up and ending on time, right?
Yes.
Or like
Yes.
space, right? Or physical, right? So there's a lot of different elements to boundaries here. But I
Right.
was actually going to mention that earlier too, around physical boundaries, right? Like some people might think, oh, well, is it okay to shake hands, right? Or after you've been meeting a while, like, is it okay to give a hug, right? It's like,
Right.
as
Right.
therapists, we have to give some strong considerations to those questions.
Right. Well, and one thing that I do tell my clients in the first or second session is, hey, just FYI, if I see you on the street, I'm not going to be acknowledging you. I'm going to step back. If you want to acknowledge me, great. But I'm not going to be seeking you out. Hey, how you doing? And I'm in a professional seat. And I brought up the physical thing. I don't want to assume that people should automatically know that a therapist should not be putting hands on you. I know there are somatic psychotherapists who are involved, are massage therapists as well. There's a whole world out there about the world of touch, but and are you comfortable? Like if you're meeting with your therapist in person, are you in a comfortable spot in the room? Something that I'm very aware of when I work one-on-one with people is I never want to sit and block a door, because regardless of the person's personal history, I want the client to always know there's an exit if they're getting uncomfortable. And it's a mental thing. It's something that I learned from one of my professors way long ago, but it's
Huh.
nice, if you're a person that is more comfortable in a certain area of the room, take that seat. This is your time, your space to feel comfortable and share. So I always want people to feel physically safe and comfortable.
I like the idea too when you were talking about like, hey, if I see you on the street, right, that's something else to consider. Like, I'm not going to approach you. We do that just to expand on that, right? We do that when we're talking about confidentiality breach, right?
Yes,
That's why, right? We are honoring the client's
yes,
confidentiality and also their autonomy. We don't like to assume anything here, right? So it's great to just like get it all out there and just like, clarify things.
right,
Right, like
right.
clarifying questions, right?
Yeah,
Right,
serious.
so that we don't have to assume, right?
Right,
So that we are of
right.
the same understanding.
Yeah. And, I just, got a light bulb also. A lot of times we go to health professionals and we're looking obviously for their expertise. But that's what's different about therapy compared to, say, maybe a physician, an MD that you go to that you don't understand the body and its complexities like they do. A therapist understands the complexities maybe of the mind, but actually it's you that are in charge of you. We're looking to you to see yourself in a different light. It's not about us necessarily imparting and channeling you in a specific way. It's a very different relationship than other healthcare providers. But I think
Absolutely.
some
Yeah,
people come into a therapist saying, fix me or fix my family member. That's not our role, not in marriage and family therapy, at least.
right. Yeah, we mentioned last episode, right, that the client is the expert in their own lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep. And so considering that, right? It's like, okay, so say for example, you're in therapy and we think about, okay, so we've kind of screened some red flags, right? And we feel like, okay, I feel like I can keep on going with this, right? Um, like you said, it's not the role of the therapist to keep in touch with the client in between sessions, say, hey, did you practice that homework we talked about, right?
Yeah,
That's
right.
not, we are
Right.
not going to do that, right?
Right.
That's in
Right.
the hands of the client, right?
Yes.
And so what I like to think about too, because we have so many, we all have the same amount of hours within the week, right? And the time that we are with the client is such a small portion of that, right? Within that week. And so what happens out of session, I would almost venture to say, is more important than what happens in session.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what I like to think about is I love alliterations. And so I was kind of thinking it's like in between sessions, if we can get into this place of engaging in reflection, reinforcing, and rewarding, right? That's like really us being an active participant in our own change or recovery or however you want to put it.
Absolutely. Yes. And, something that I talk to clients about too is after our session, take a walk. Try not to just jump back into your life quickly, just so the dust can settle. Because, I use the analogy of when we change our bed linens, and if there's sunbeams, you see a lot of dust and lint in the air, right? Flying. That's what happens after a therapeutic session, particularly some of the deeper ones, the nitty gritty ones. Let that dust settle just a little bit. Maybe not rush back to work or rush back to schoolwork or resume your life.
Or take a moment to maybe journal, right? So what we're talking about here are
Exactly.
these acts of reflection, right? So whatever it might be, somebody might want to go for a hike or go for a
Exactly.
swim or whatever, right? Just engaging in some act of reflection to kind of digest.
Right, right. And then being clear, if you talk about, I talk a lot about communication skills. What do you want to practice during the week? The therapist could be there potentially to offer you some accountability. Yeah, I do need to broach hard subjects more often. How do I do that? What seems to work? Being curious of why you're having the reaction you're having to slowing down things. So you have an interaction with your supervisor and you're like, something was off there. Taking that moment, journaling, stopping, taking a few breaths. Hey, take 5 minutes in the bathroom. If you need a break in a situation that you're kind of feeling more trapped in, like when we're at work or we're in a family gathering, go to the bathroom for 5 or 10 minutes and say, okay, I got to do a check-in with myself. Very important.
I like that idea. You've mentioned it a couple times, and I have to re-emphasize it, right? That process of slowing down.
Yeah.
Right. It's easy. I know for me as a therapist and even as a client, right? I'm like, all right, let's go, right? Let's talk, let's go. But it's like, it's like, no, like that art, it's an art, right? It's an art of slowing down. Like there's huge advantage into that.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I mean, this time with your therapist should really be very sacred time that it's about you. Once again, disclosure of the therapist. Yeah, sometimes there is a good reason why the therapist is sharing a personal situation. That's valid, but they're only talking about themselves and what they're going through. Red flag, right? This
Absolutely.
is your time for and it's amazing the number of clients that want to turn around and say, well, how are you doing? And it's so sweet and it's so lovely. But, this isn't a, time to talk about the therapist. It's your time to maybe even just sit and be quiet with your therapist. Doesn't mean you're chatting the entire, 55-minute session away.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Yeah. Sitting in that silence, sometimes that's an intervention.
Right. Right.
When you talk about the, kind of like taking what was discussed in session and figuring out how do I integrate that into my life, right? In addition to these kind of reflection practices, right? We can also engage in these reinforcement practices as well. Whereas, okay, and I like to think of it too, it alludes to what you were saying earlier, where we want we want people to feel successful in adapting to these changes. And in order to do that, we want the suggestions to be so simple that it's almost laughable,
Yeah.
right? So literally just picking one thing to focus on and just focusing on that.
And I have to say, I really encourage my clients to come back and say, wow, that didn't work for me. Because just as this isn't about an easy A, right? This is about the classes that I remember the most about from my college and master's program days are the ones that challenged me the most, that I had to work really hard in. Sometimes I got a B in them or C even, but I remember a lot because making mistakes you learn from. And in our culture, it's really hard to make mistakes for many different reasons.
I definitely remember my heart is when I think about curriculum, right? And it's like, yeah, the one class that stands out initially, right, is the statistics class and on research. That I was like, oh my God, me and my colleague were like, how are we going to get through this class, right? It's like, and yet
Right,
that one
right,
happens to stick out the most.
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have the reflection, right? And then reinforcing, but then
Right.
also rewarding, right?
Yeah.
We're not going through this work just for for the fun of it, you know what I mean? It can be hard work. We are going against the grain. So
Absolutely.
we
Oops.
are going against automatic ways of thinking and behaving that have been in our lives for X amount of years, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
to acknowledge that for ourselves and give ourselves that grace, right? And to provide ourselves the ability to kind of engage in some kind of reward just to say, hey, we're doing the thing, right? We're actually showing up, right? Part of that can be, identifying what are some of our own support systems in between sessions, right?
Right.
That people
Right.
can help us kind of hone in on what it is that we're striving to achieve.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's so important that, doing what is best for us doesn't always feel good. And it's, that conditioning that we've received, whether it's the way we were raised or the educational system we were put into, uh, going into work and how we're treated, in the work environment, that determines a lot of how we behave. So we
Or
have
even
to
cultural considerations too, right? Like when
absolutely
that could be, it's another whole topic on another episode, right? But
right.
also thinking of, how, from a cultural perspective, what do people think about therapy and is disclosure okay, right? Do
Right.
I want to talk with my friends and family about this in between sessions, right? Like the way that they
Right.
engage in the therapeutic process can be unique to them from a cultural consideration standpoint.
Absolutely. I mean, there are many people, there's still a stigma about mental health in our culture. And and this is your privacy. So once again, another level of confidentiality. You don't have to share with anyone that you're in therapy. That's for you. This is part of your self-care and self-growth.
Yeah, and everything we talk about here, right? It's all for consideration, right? We're
Absolutely.
just like, again, this is like, again, people have their own free agency, right? Their own, they can engage in free choice, right? What I like to think of too is, when you talk about some things that they try to practice, like, oh well, that didn't work, right? I always tell clients, it's I'm throwing darts, right? So if it doesn't stick, it doesn't stick, and we can choose something else, not a problem. Like
Right.
I'm not tied to anything. It's just about them exploring and playing with different things, right? Being willing to engage in that process too, right?
Right. Right.
And just practicing different things and see what eventually does stick. Because what we're looking at here are sustainable changes over time across internal and external stressors that we're all going to face time to
Right.
time, right?
Right.
And so that's why I think of this reflection, reinforce, and reward. If we can engage in that process, that's going to help integrate it into ourselves and our way of being and make it more sustainable.
Right. Right. And I love that term reward because a lot of people do come to therapy in their life because their coping mechanisms were working and now they aren't. So they're not getting that reward anymore. So they're looking for some other ideas potentially, or some other, but I think this whole I'm very cautious around blame and shame in the therapy room, and I know that you are too, Dalton. That this isn't about blaming yourself. Oh, I'm not getting the communication skill right, or oh, I can't do this, or I'll never feel X. And hopefully, your therapist creates space for you to explore why you're having those extreme feelings, and how to help you get over those hurdles. We have to be trained. We don't just sit down and play Chopin at the piano. There's
Exactly.
training there.
Yeah, and I think of it as you're talking about that, I think of it as kind of like if I'm on this side of the bridge and I want to get over here to this side of the bridge, but I don't know how to get over there, right? I don't know that this part over here is even there, right? So I'm
Right.
just stuck on this side of the bridge. So it's about identifying what's on the other side of that bridge, right? How can I get there? Right. And then once I've identified it and I've had an experience in that place, now I have somewhere else to go. Without having that experience, I'm like kind of wandering around and kind of clueless.
Right. 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 I mean, I always like to give the analogy of what was something that someone took you through and you had to learn. I think one of the most dramatic things for me was learning how to drive a car. I mean, I initially sat in a car and said, there's no way I'm going to be able to look in rearview mirrors and side mirrors and turn my head. And granted, we have cameras now on cars and a lot of the new ones, but all of a sudden now I drive effortlessly without thinking about it. I mean, that's how we all want to live our lives, making authentic decisions more automatically and empowering
I'm
ourselves.
glad you said automatic because I do not know how to drive a stick shift.
Yeah, right. I used to. I don't think I could do it anymore. Yeah, I just think, reminding folks that this is a process of, for me, curiosity. I know that's the way my mentor has pushed on me. Are you curious enough? Is your therapist curious about you? Are you curious about your own responses and judgments and thought processes? And just think of things that way. It's really trying to step out of the spider web that you're currently caught in so that then you can see the full picture and make empowered decisions.
Great. Yeah, that's a great way to wrap up this episode. Right.
Yeah.
So appreciate you joining us today. And again, who knows, maybe you can join us on a future episode, right? Where I just love that idea of it, incorporating the body, movements of the body into therapy. I'm really more curious about that.
Absolutely. I'd love to. It's been a pleasure, Dalton.
Thanks for tuning in this week. Be sure to check out our next episode as we continue to explore more elements of your therapeutic journey.